The crest is simple. A clenched hand. 5 arrows, held tightly together. Alone, an arrow can be snapped with little effort. Together, they cannot be broken. That image would come to represent one of the most powerful financial dynasties in European history. The Rothschild family, but in the beginning, there was no empire. There was only a narrow street in Frankfurt in the mid-18th century. Frankfurt's Jewish community lived inside the Judengasse, a cramped ghetto sealed at night by gates. Houses leaned into each other across alleyways barely wide enough for carts. Restrictions governed where Jews could live, what professions they could enter, and how wealth could be displayed. It was here, in 1744, that Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born. He was not born into power. He was born into limitation. His father was a small-time coin dealer and trader. Their home doubled as a shop. Ancient coins, medals, and curiosities passed through their hands. It was not glamorous work, but it required knowledge of history, of authenticity, of value. Mayer learned quickly that value is not always visible to the untrained eye. He studied coins not just as objects, but as stories. Who minted them? Which prince commissioned them? Which war funded their creation? Every coin was connected to power, and power, he realized, could be studied. Frankfurt in the late 1700s was not yet the financial hub it would become, but it was politically important. Princes, nobles, and merchants moved through its markets. Information traveled by courier. Deals were sealed in private rooms. Mayer understood something critical at a young age. Access matters more than status. As a Jewish merchant, he could not easily hold office or command troops, but he could handle money. He could build trust, and trust, in the world of princes, was currency. He cultivated relationships patiently. One of the most important would be with Prince William of Hesse, one of the wealthiest rulers in Europe at the time. The prince needed reliable agents to manage assets, move funds discreetly, and handle investments across borders. Mayer positioned himself as that agent. He was meticulous, discreet, loyal, and gradually, doors opened. The first breakthrough did not look like an empire. It looked like a contract, a small administrative role, a trusted intermediary. But in finance, proximity to power is everything. Mayer began handling larger sums. He facilitated transactions for aristocratic clients. He reinvested profits carefully. He did not spend lavishly. He did not seek spectacle. He built quietly. By the end of the 18th century, Europe was changing. Revolutionary ideas were spreading. Monarchies were under strain. The French Revolution would soon ignite upheaval across the continent. War was coming, and war requires money. Mayer had 5 sons: Amschel Solomon, Nathan, Karl James. He did not see them merely as heirs. He saw them as extensions of a system. If capital could move across borders faster than armies, influence would follow. If information could travel through trusted family channels, advantage would multiply. So he made a decision that would define the dynasty. He would not keep his sons in Frankfurt. He would send them out. 5 sons, 5 cities, 1 network. Nathan would go to London, the rising financial capital. James to parties, the heart of continental politics. Solomon to Vienna, the Habsburg stronghold. Carto Naples gateway to southern Europe. Amschel would remain in Frankfurt. It was a radical strategy for its time. There were no telephones, no telegraphs. Messages traveled by horse and ship. But the Rothschilds developed a private courier system that moved faster than most governments. Family codes ensured secrecy. Information flowed inward before it flowed outward. Unity became their strength. When Napoleon's wars swept across Europe, governments were desperate. Armies needed funding. Supplies needed financing. Gold needed transport across hostile borders. The Rothschild network was ready, because while monarchies fought for territory, the family focused on liquidity. They did not need crowns. They needed contracts. The image of the 5 arrows was not decorative. It was instructional. If the brothers competed against each other, the system would fracture. If they cooperated, they could dominate. Family agreements reinforced loyalty. Marriages often remained within extended family circles to consolidate wealth and trust. Profits were shared. Strategy was coordinated. Europe had banks before the Rothschilds, but it had never seen a multinational family banking network operating in synchronized alignment across its most powerful capitals. And that changed everything. As wars escalated, so did their influence. Governments turned to them not just for loans, but for advice. Financial markets responded to their movements. Their reputation grew. Admired by some, feared by others. They were not kings, but kings depended on them. The ghetto-born coin dealer had become architect of a continental system. Yet, even at the height of expansion, the principle remained simple. 5 arrows are stronger than one. This is not just the story of wealth. It is the story of coordination, of discipline, of a family that understood something before the rest of Europe did. Money moves faster than armies, and when it moves through one united hand, it can shape history. The central question remains, how did one family finance Europe? The answer begins with 5 arrows, and a decision made in a narrow street in Frankfurt, where a young man realized that unity is the first form of power. Chapter 2, born in the ghetto, before the 5 arrows, before London and Paris, before governments and gold ships, there was a locked gate. Every night in Frankfurt's Judengasse, the gates closed. Iron bars sealed the narrow street where the city's Jewish families were required to live. Guards monitored movement. Curfews were enforced. Restrictions were routine. In the 18th century, Jews in many German territories were not citizens in the modern sense. They were tolerated, taxed separately. Limited in profession, forbidden from owning certain property, forbidden from joining guilds. They could not easily become soldiers. They could not hold public office. They could not freely move into the city's main districts. They lived where they were told to live. It was into this world that Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born in 1744. The Judengasse was crowded and poor. Houses leaned inward, stories stacked high above narrow alleyways. Sunlight struggled to reach the street, but inside those cramped buildings, commerce never stopped. Restrictions often shape ingenuity. Since Jews were excluded from many trades, they gravitated toward areas that were still accessible small-scale finance, money changing, trading coins and precious metals. These were portable professions, knowledge-based professions. Mayer's father, Amschel Moses Rothschild, was a coin dealer and small merchant. He handled rare coins, metals, and antique pieces that circulated among collectors and minor nobles. It was delicate work. A rare coin is not valuable because it shines. It is valuable because someone believes it is authentic, because someone trusts the dealer. Trust was the first lesson Mayer absorbed. As a child, he learned to inspect metal, to understand inscriptions, to distinguish real from counterfeit. But more importantly, he learned to observe people. Nobles who collected coins were not merely hobbyists. They were politically connected men, often seeking status through rare artifacts. If you could earn their confidence in something as trivial as a coin, you might earn their confidence in something larger. The Judengasse may have been physically confined, but Mayer's attention was not. He studied Hebrew texts in his youth and was initially intended for religious scholarship. But circumstances intervened. His parents died when he was still young, and he was sent to Hanover to apprentice in a banking house. There, he learned the broader mechanics of finance, bills of exchange, credit arrangements, cross-border payments. Hanover expanded his horizon. When he returned to Frankfurt, he did not return as merely a ghetto merchant's son. He returned with ambition sharpened by experience. He reopened the family coin business, but he did not confine it to coin trading. He expanded into financial services for the wealthy. He positioned himself as someone who could handle delicate transactions discreetly. Discretion was currency in Europe's aristocratic circles. One of his most important connections came through Prince William of Hesse-Kassel, one of the richest rulers in Europe at the time. The prince accumulated vast wealth, partly from renting soldiers to foreign powers, including Britain during the American Revolutionary War. Managing such wealth required trusted intermediaries. Mayer understood the opportunity. He presented himself not as a challenger, but as a loyal servant. He offered precision, accuracy, confidentiality. Gradually, The relationship deepened. Prince William began using Mayer to handle financial matters, including investments and asset transfers. For a Jewish merchant from the ghetto, this access was extraordinary. He was becoming what was known as a court factor, a financial agent serving a princely household. The title carried risk and reward. Court factors were trusted insiders, but they also depended entirely on the favor of their patron. Lose trust, and everything vanished. Mayer did not lose trust. He reinforced it. He understood that proximity to power mattered more than display of wealth. He did not flaunt riches. He reinvested earnings. He strengthened relationships. Most importantly, he planned. He did not intend to remain confined to Frankfurt's ghetto economy forever. The restrictions that shaped his early life did not embitter him. They sharpened him. If auras were closed, he would enter through contracts. If status was denied, he would build leverage. By the late 1700s, Europe was shifting. Political tensions simmered in France. Economic imbalances grew. Monarchies were accumulating debt. EBT requires management. Mayer positioned himself precisely where management would be needed. His breakthrough was not dramatic. There was no public coronation. It was incremental. A trusted transaction here, a reliable shipment there. A reputation for integrity spreading quietly. Rome exclusion, he moved to Axis. He ghetto gate, still closed at night. UT. His influence now crossed them daily. He understood something fundamental about power. It does not always sit in palaces. Sometimes it sits in ledgers. The boy born behind locked gates was learning to unlock systems. And as he watched Europe edge toward revolution and war, he saw not chaos, but opportunity. He had 5 sons, and he would not let them inherit the confines of the Judeng. He would give them cities instead. From a narrow street in Frankfurt would emerge a network that would finance armies, advise monarchs, and alter the financial architecture of Europe. But it began here, in confinement, in restriction, in a place where exclusion taught discipline, and discipline opened doors. From the ghetto to the court, from limitation to leverage, the transformation had begun. Chapter 3, The 5 Sons' Strategy. Mayer Amschel Rothschild did not leave behind a throne. He left behind instructions. By the early 19th century, he had built influence in Frankfurt as a trusted court factor to Prince William of Hesse. His name carried weight in financial circles, but Mayer understood something most bankers of his time did not. Local success is fragile. Wars redraw borders. Princes fall. Cities decline. A fortune tied to one ruler, one territory, or one court can disappear overnight. If the family was to survive and grow, it needed to be everywhere. So he made the decision that would define the dynasty. He would not keep his sons close. He would send them out. Amschel would remain in Frankfurt, the foundation. Salomon would go to Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg Empire. Nathan would go to London, rising financial capital of Europe. Karl would move to Naples, gateway to southern power. James would settle in Paris, center of political upheaval and opportunity. 5 sons, 5 capitals, 1 strategy. This was not exile. It was expansion. At the time, no banking family operated across Europe with synchronized coordination. Most firms were local, dependent on regional trade, and limited by slow communication. Mayer was building something different. He was building a network. Nathan's move to London proved especially significant. Britain was ascending economically. Its financial markets were becoming more sophisticated. Its global trade routes spanned oceans. London was not just a city. It was the future. In Paris, James entered a continent shaken by revolution and Napoleon's campaigns. Political instability created constant need for financial intermediaries. Governments rose and fell. Credit had to move faster than armies. In Vienna, Salomon positioned himself at the core of imperial administration. The Austrian Empire was vast and bureaucratic, fertile ground for bond issuance and state finance. In Naples, Karl established influence in southern Europe, expanding reach into Mediterranean networks. And in Frankfurt, Amschel maintained the original base, preserving relationships, consolidating assets, and coordinating strategy. But geography alone was not the genius. The genius was communication. The brothers developed a private courier system that moved information across borders faster than most governments could manage. Trusted messengers rode day and night. Ships carried coded letters. Signals were encrypted. Speed became power. In a world without telegraphs, information delay could cost fortunes. If bond prices shifted in London before Paris received the news, the family could act in the gap. They built code systems within their correspondence, shorthand references only they understood. Financial positions were disguised in language. Political rumors were relayed discreetly. Secrecy was protection, but secrecy alone does not create unity. The family created internal agreements that bound the brothers together. Profits were shared across branches. Major decisions required coordination. Marriages often remained within extended family circles, reinforcing loyalty and minimizing external influence. They understood the risk of fragmentation. If one brother sought dominance over the others, the structure would weaken. If branches competed instead of cooperating, rivals would exploit division. The five arrows symbol was not decorative, it was doctrine. Never break the arrows. At the heart of this strategy was trust, not blind trust, but disciplined trust, reinforced by shared interest. Each branch operated locally but reported centrally. Intelligence gathered in Vienna informed decisions in London. Parisian political developments shaped bond pricing strategies elsewhere. They were not five separate banks. They were one organism with five limbs. As Europe descended into the Napoleonic Wars, their system was tested. Governments were desperate for capital. Armies required funding for supplies, weapons, and logistics. Transporting gold across war zones was perilous. But the Rothschild network could move funds across borders with relative reliability. When British forces needed financing to sustain campaigns against Napoleon, Nathan in London coordinated shipments supported by his brothers across the continent. Risk was immense, but so was reward. By the end of the wars, the Rothschild name had become synonymous with reliability and sovereign finance. They had demonstrated not just capital reserves, but operational precision. They had done what few families had done before. They built a multinational banking network before the concept existed. Europe's monarchies were used to dealing with local financiers. Now they faced a coordinated family with reach across capitals. Debt could be issued in one city and serviced in another. Bonds could be distributed through multiple markets simultaneously. Information moved internally before markets could react. This was not merely expansion. It was transformation. The Rothschilds were no longer court factors confined to Frankfurt. They were architects of cross-border finance. The turning point had arrived. From five separate placements emerged something new, a financial web spanning Europe's most powerful cities, and at its center was a simple rule passed from father to sons. Stay united. Because unity was leveraged, and leverage, in a century defined by war and revolution, was the most powerful currency of all. The five arrows, held in Europe, would soon learn what that meant. Chapter 4, War is Business. When Europe went to war, governments ran out of money before they ran out of soldiers. Cannons required metal. Armies required food. Horses required feed, and none of it moved without gold. By the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte had reshaped the continent. Kingdoms collapsed. Borders shifted. Coalitions formed and dissolved. Every power in Europe needed financing urgently. For most bankers, war meant danger. For the Rothschild brothers, war meant demand. Nathan Mayer, Rothschild in London, James Mayer de Rothschild in Paris, Salomon Mayer born Rothschild in Vienna, Karl Mayer born Rothschild in Naples, and Amschel in Frankfurt were positioned exactly where governments were most desperate. War creates chaos. Chaos creates debt, and debt creates leverage. The Napoleonic Wars were not only battles of soldiers, they were battles of liquidity. Britain, in particular, faced the enormous task of financing campaigns across Europe while sustaining its navy and supporting allies. The British government needed gold, not promises, not paper, but physical gold shipped across hostile territory to pay troops. Transporting gold during wartime was perilous. Roads were unsafe. Seas were contested. Caravans were vulnerable to theft or interception. But the Rothschild network had something few others possessed: cross-border coordination and trust. Nathan in London raised capital through government bonds. His brothers coordinated transfers across Europe. Couriers carried intelligence about troop movements and political shifts. Shipments were routed creatively to avoid seizure. It was a logistical ballet performed in the shadow of Canaan fire. In 1811, Nathan secured a contract to supply gold to the British Army operating under the Duke of Wellington in Spain and Portugal. The task required moving enormous sums discreetly and reliably. Failure would mean reputational ruin. Success would mean unparalleled influence. They succeeded. Gold flowed where governments needed it most. The Rothschilds became indispensable intermediaries. They did not merely lend money, they solved problems. In wartime, reliability is power. Their advantage was not only capital, it was speed. Without telegraphs, information traveled slowly. But the Rothschilds' private courier network often outpaced official government channels. Intelligence about battles, treaties, and political shifts reached their desks before markets could react. This informational edge allowed them to act decisively in bond markets, and nowhere was that advantage more legendary than after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The story has been retold in dramatic variations for 2 centuries. According to popular legend, Nathan Rothschild learned of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo before the British government officially announced it. Armed with early knowledge, he allegedly began selling British bonds on the London Exchange, triggering panic among other traders who believed Britain had lost. Prices collapsed. Then, at the bottom, he allegedly bought aggressively, securing enormous profit. Once victory was confirmed, and bond prices soared. The legend paints him as a master manipulator who engineered panic to dominate the market. Historians debate the accuracy of the details. Evidence suggests he did receive news early through his network. Evidence also suggests he positioned himself strategically in bond markets. But whether exaggerated or precise, the legend reflects a deeper truth. Speed and information meant power in finance, and power in finance meant influence in politics. The aftermath of Waterloo marked a turning point. Napoleon was defeated. Europe sought stability. Governments needed to refinance debts accumulated during years of warfare. The Rothschilds were ready. They arranged large sovereign bond issues for major European powers. They became central to rebuilding financial credibility after war. Their name carried weight in bond markets across London, Paris, Vienna, and beyond. They were no longer just facilitators. They were architects. By coordinating across capitals, they could distribute government bonds simultaneously in multiple markets. If one city hesitated, another could absorb supply. Risk was diversified across geography. This was innovation. Modern multinational banking was being born in real time. Their reputation grew accordingly. Monarchs treated them not merely as bankers, but as advisors. Political leaders understood that access to capital often depended on maintaining trust with the Rothschild network. Yet their power remained unofficial. They held no crowns. They commanded no armies, but they financed both. And in the calculus of modern Europe, financing could matter as much as force. Critics whispered competitors. MBA governments depended. War had accelerated their rise faster than any peacetime expansion could have. The 5 arrows had proven their strength. Each brother operated locally, but the family acted globally. Profits from London reinforced operations in Vienna. Paris supported Naples. Frankfurt coordinated the flow. Unity multiplied leverage. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Rothschild name was synonymous with sovereign finance. They had helped fund the coalition that defeated Napoleon. They had stabilized bond markets in turbulent times. War had been devastating for Europe. For the Rothschilds, it had been transformative. They understood a principle that would define the 19th century. Governments can command soldiers, but soldiers march on money, and whoever controls the flow of money during war holds a form of quiet supremacy. The Napoleonic era did not make them kings. It made them indispensable. And in Europe's new order, indispensability was more durable than crowns. War had created debt. Debt had created leverage, and leverage had created a financial empire that now stretched from London to Naples, from Vienna to Paris. The 5 arrows held, and the continent would never look at banking the same way again. Chapter 5. The London Pivot. If Frankfurt was the birthplace, London was the accelerator. By the early 19th century, London had become the financial nerve center of the world. The British Empire stretched across oceans, trade routes, connected continents. Insurance houses, stock exchanges, and shipping firms thrived along the Thames. And at the heart of it all stood one man, Nathan Mayer Rothschild. Nathan was different from his brothers. Where others were methodical and diplomatic, Nathan was aggressive, sharp, direct. He understood markets not as polite institutions, but as battlegrounds. When he arrived in England in the late 1790s, he began modestly, trading textiles from Manchester. But textiles were only the doorway. He quickly shifted toward finance. London's government bond market was expanding rapidly. Britain financed wars not through taxation alone, but through bond issuance, borrowing from investors in exchange for future repayment. Government bonds were the bloodstream of the empire. Nathan positioned himself at its center. After the Napoleonic Wars, Britain faced enormous debt. Managing that debt required stability in bond markets. Investors needed confidence. Prices needed coordination. Nathan provided both. Through the Rothschild network, British bonds were marketed not only in London but also across continental Europe. Investors in Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt could participate in British sovereign debt. This cross-border distribution strengthened Britain's credit and strengthened Nathan's leverage. But with dominance came rumors. The Waterloo legend still hovered over his reputation. Stories circulated in London's coffee houses and trading floors that Nathan had single-handedly manipulated the market, that he had orchestrated panic to accumulate vast holdings, that he had become Britain's secret financial ruler. The truth was more complex. He was certainly powerful. He was certainly informed, and he was certainly decisive. But markets are rarely controlled by one man alone. Still, perception matters. And perception elevated him. By the 1820s, the name Rothschild carried weight in London's Exchange Alley. When Nathan moved, traders watched. When he spoke, governments listened. He was no longer simply arranging loans. He was shaping outcomes. Beyond sovereign bonds, Nathan expanded into infrastructure financing. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Britain. Railways, canals, and mining ventures required enormous capital investment. Traditional aristocrats lacked liquidity for such projects. The Rothschild house provided it. They financed railway expansions across Europe. They supported mining enterprises, including investments in gold and mercury operations. Infrastructure became the next frontier. Unlike war bonds, infrastructure financing built permanent influence. A railway line funded today would generate revenue for decades. A mining contract secured today would yield control over critical resources. This was strategic evolution. The family was transitioning from emergency, wartime lenders to architects of economic modernization. Nathan's London office became the strongest branch of the network. It handled the largest transactions. It commanded the deepest liquidity pools. And London itself was ascending globally. The British Empire's reach meant that financial flows through London affected colonies, trade partners, and industrial hubs worldwide. Nay understood scale. He built alliances with powerful political figures, though rarely in public view. He maintained relationships with government officials without becoming overtly political. Influence without visibility. That was the balance. He never sought public office. He did not command regiments. But Britain's ability to finance expansion often intersected with his house. Citex whispered again. Was he too powerful? Was one banking family becoming indispensable to the British state? E.t. Indispensability was precisely the point. Governments returned repeatedly because the Rothschilds delivered reliability. They offered lower interest rates when confidence was high. They coordinated multi-city bond placements. They stabilized volatile markets. In time, Nathan moved from the margins of Britain's financial world to its core. He built a grand residence in London. He entered elite society. The ghetto-born dynasty now mingled with aristocracy. But something had shifted. The Rothschilds were no longer outsiders, seeking access. They were insiders, shaping decisions, from lenders to influencers. Their advice carried weight beyond transaction size. When governments considered bond restructuring, they consulted the House of Rothschild. When foreign states sought credibility in London markets, they approached Nathan first. Power had become institutional. The 5-Arrow network still functioned, but London was now the pivot point, and Nathan was its axis. The family's earlier strategy, geographic dispersion, coded communication, shared profit structures, had matured into continental dominance. Yet dominance invited scrutiny. Political tensions simmered across Europe. Nationalism was rising. Revolutions would soon erupt in 1830 and again in 1848. Financial houses that appeared close to power often became targets during unrest. Nathan understood this risk. He maintained discretion publicly, even as his influence expanded privately. By the time of his death in 1836, the London branch was the strongest in the network. It had financed wars, railways, and governments. It had shaped bond markets and navigated political storms. It had turned the Rothschild name into a symbol of financial authority. The transformation was complete. They were no longer merely bankers facilitating transactions. They were brokers of stability. And in a century defined by upheaval, stability was the most valuable commodity of all. The 5 Arrows had evolved. Unity had created reach. Reach had created influence. And in London, influence had become power. Chapter 6. Kings need bankers' crowns glitter, but they are heavy. In the 19th century, European monarchs ruled vast territories, commanded armies, and claimed a divine authority. Yet beneath the ceremony and silk uniforms lay a quieter truth. Kingdoms ran on credit. Wars had emptied treasuries. Revolutions had shaken legitimacy. Industrial expansion demanded new capital. Railways needed steel, coal, and land. Mines required labor and machinery. Power required money. And money increasingly flowed through one network. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschild houses in London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt had become the preferred financiers of European states. Their reputation for reliability made them the first call when governments needed large-scale loans. They arranged sovereign bonds for Austria, France, Britain, and other states navigating post-war recovery and modernization. Loans were structured across multiple cities, spreading risk and increasing investor confidence. This was more than banking. It was political architecture. When a monarchy secured a loan through the Rothschild network, it signaled stability to markets. Confidence attracted further investment. Stability reduced borrowing costs. Confidence in finance is power. Yet the Rothschilds held no formal political office. They were not ministers. They were not generals. They were not crowned. But they often shaped what kings could afford to do. Railways were the next frontier. Europe's industrial revolution demanded infrastructure at unprecedented scale. Tracks cut through countryside. Steam engines shrank distances. Coal mines expanded to feed factories and locomotives. Financing such transformation required enormous capital pools. The Rothschild houses stepped in. They funded railway expansion across France, Austria, and beyond. They invested in lines that connected major cities and facilitated trade. They supported mining ventures that extracted the raw materials fueling industrial growth. Railways were not merely transportation projects. They were instruments of national integration and economic power. By financing them, the family inserted itself into the backbone of Europe's modernization. In Austria, Salomon Mayer von Rothschild played a central role in financing the Northern Railway, linking Vienna to the empire's industrial regions. In France, James Mayer de Rothschild backed critical rail infrastructure that reshaped the nation's economy. Through these ventures, the family diversified beyond sovereign debt. They were no longer dependent solely on war or state borrowing. They were partners in industry. Industry outlives wars. This shift strengthened their resilience. But with industrial influence came deeper political entanglement. Governments do not borrow from strangers. They borrow from those they trust. Trust meant access. Access meant influence. When monarchs faced fiscal crises, they turned privately to Rothschild advisors. When political transitions threatened bond stability, the family quietly mediated between competing factions. They practiced diplomacy without portfolios. Letters moved between capitals. Couriers carried not just financial updates, but political intelligence. The network functioned as an informal information grid spanning Europe's most sensitive corridors of power. They rarely sought publicity. Discretion protected them. If they appeared divisible, suspicion would rise. If they appeared indispensable, resentment could follow. So they positioned themselves carefully, close enough to shape outcomes, distant enough to avoid direct blame. They sat behind thrones, not on them. In Paris, James navigated shifting regimes from monarchy to republic to empire and back again. He financed governments of different political colors, focusing on stability over ideology. In Vienna, the family maintained relationships within the Habsburg court while expanding industrial investments. In London, the house remained deeply tied to sovereign bond markets, but avoided overt political alignment. This neutrality was strategic. Power changes hands. Debt remains. By serving states rather than factions, the Rothschilds ensured continuity. Their influence was evident, but subtle. A delayed loan could pressure a government. Favorable bond pricing could strengthen a regime's legitimacy. They did not need to command troops to shape outcomes. They needed to manage liquidity. Critics began noticing the pattern. How could one family operate so seamlessly across rival nations? How could bankers serve governments that were sometimes in conflict with each other? The answer lay in structure. The Fivaro network functioned as coordinated but locally embedded houses. Each branch understood its national context while maintaining family cohesion. They financed France without betraying Britain. They supported Austria while preserving ties elsewhere. This balancing act required precision. A misstep could destroy trust. But precision was their craft. By mid-century, the Rothschild name symbolized not only wealth, but financial credibility. Smaller states sought their endorsement before issuing bonds. Investors trusted offerings associated with their house. Credibility is a form of currency, and credibility, once earned, compounds. Yet their position remained delicate. Nationalism was rising. Anti-Jewish sentiment simmered in parts of Europe. Revolutionary movements questioned aristocratic privilege and financial concentration alike. Power invites scrutiny. The family responded not with spectacle, but with restraint. They expanded art collections, built grand residences, and entered elite society. But they avoided flamboyant political statements. Visibility without provocation. Behind gilded doors, they reviewed ledgers that mapped Europe's fiscal health. Behind court ceremonies, they assessed credit risk. They did not overthrow kings. They financed them. And in a century defined by industrial acceleration and political upheaval, financing often mattered more than ceremony. The transformation was complete. They had moved from ghetto merchants to continental financiers. From lenders in wartime to architects of infrastructure, from outsiders seeking entry to insiders shaping policy. Kings still wore crowns, but behind the crowns stood balance sheets. And on those balance sheets, the Rothschild name appeared again and again. They did not sit on thrones, they sat behind them. And sometimes, that was the stronger position. Chapter 7. Fear of the Invisible Power. Power that is visible can be challenged. Power that is invisible is feared. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschild name carried enormous weight in financial circles. Governments borrowed from them. Railways were built with their capital. Monarchs consulted them quietly. But outside elite rooms, something darker was growing. Europe was changing. Nationalism surged across the continent. Revolutions in 1830 and 1848 shook capitals from Paris to Vienna. Industrialization created both wealth and inequality. Political movements blamed elites for economic instability. And when wealth concentrates quietly, suspicion follows loudly. The Rothschilds were uniquely exposed. They were wealthy. They were Jewish. They operated across borders. An age of rising nationalism. That combination triggered hostility. Anti-Semitism in Europe was not new. It had existed for centuries in religious and social forms. But in the 19th century, it evolved into political rhetoric. Jewish banking families became symbols and narratives about foreign influence and hidden control. The fact that the Rothschilds financed multiple governments did not appear as neutrality to critics. It appeared as manipulation. Pamphlets circulated, claiming the families secretly controlled wars. Cartoons exaggerated their features, portraying them as puppet masters pulling the strings of monarchs. Newspapers hinted that no treaty could be signed without their approval. These accusations rarely relied on evidence. They relied on fear. Financial influence is difficult to see. Most people do not witness bond issuances or infrastructure negotiations. They see outcomes: rising debt, new railways, shifting governments. When outcomes are complex, simple villains become convenient. The Rothschild name became shorthand for invisible power. In reality, they were bankers operating within systems that governments invited them into. But perception rarely follows nuance. Wealth, especially discrete wealth, invites imagination. Their cross-border structure intensified suspicion. Nationalists argued that loyalty should belong to the nation, not to a family network spanning rival states. How could one banking house serve Britain and France, Austria, and Naples? The Rothschild answer was pragmatic. Finance transcends politics. But critics saw something else. Influence without accountability. Political hostility sharpened during times of crisis. When economies faltered or revolutions erupted, conspiracy narratives gained traction. It was easier to blame a powerful banking family than to confront structural instability. Yet, the family did not respond publicly. They did not publish rebuttals. They did not engage in polemics. They did not seek confrontation. Silence became strategy. Engaging accusations would legitimize them. Public defense would amplify rumors. Instead, they focused on performance. Deliver stable loans, honor commitments. Maintain discretion. Internally, the Favaro principles strengthened. Unity protected them from external division. If one branch faced hostility in a city, the others could provide support. If public sentiment turned volatile in one nation, cross-border diversification reduced risk. The structure that had built power now shielded it. But tension was real. In some European states, political leaders distanced themselves publicly from Jewish financiers while relying on them privately. This contradiction intensified resentment among populations already skeptical of elites. Caricatures and popular press depicted the Rothschilds as shadow rulers. Fictional works exaggerated their influence. Whispers traveled faster than facts. Power invites enemies. An invisible power invites imagination. The family understood that survival required adaptation. They increased philanthropic activities. They supported cultural institutions. They contributed to civic causes in cities where they operated. Integration into elite society became more visible. Yet they remained cautious. Too much visibility could provoke. Too much silence could invite speculation. The balance was delicate. By the late 19th century, political landscapes were shifting again. Industrial magnates emerged in Germany and the United States. New banking houses rose. The Rothschild monopoly on sovereign finance diminished gradually as markets matured. Ironically, as their relative dominance decreased, conspiracy narratives often intensified. Perception lags reality. They were no longer the singular force in European finance, yet myths portrayed them as omnipotent. The more quietly they operated, the louder rumors grew. Their wealth remained substantial. Their influence remained significant. But Europe was diversifying financially. Capital markets were expanding beyond family houses. Still, hostility did not disappear. In moments of economic anxiety, the image of the invisible banker resurfaced. The Rothschilds had moved from ghetto outsiders to continental fun. Now they were seen by some as too integrated, too powerful, too global. The paradox was clear. When they were excluded, they were limited. When they gained access, they were feared, but they endured. They did not fracture under criticism. They did not abandon cross-border unity. They reinforced internal agreements, preserved capital reserves, and avoided public political entanglement. Silence became armor. While pamphlets accused, They financed railways. While cartoons mocked, they managed bonds. While rumors spread, they reinvested. The 5 arrows held. But the atmosphere had changed. No longer were they merely admired for financial innovation. Now they were symbols in ideological battles they did not initiate. Power had elevated them, and power had made them targets. Key lesson was unmistakable. Influence, without visibility, can build empires. It can also build enemies, and the Rothschild dynasty was entering a century where enemies would become more dangerous than rumors. Chapter 8. The Empire Divides. For decades, the strength of the Rothschild Empire had been simple. 5 arrows, 1 hand. But time changes hands. By the mid to late 19th century, the founding brothers were gone. A new generation had inherited the houses of London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. The structure remained, the name remained. But unity, once enforced by Mayer's authority and reinforced by the brothers' shared struggle, was no longer automatic. Empires do not collapse overnight. They stretch first. The branches began acting with greater independence. Each house operated within its own national context, responding to local political pressures and economic shifts. London grew increasingly dominant. Britain's global empire meant larger capital flows. Paris maintained strong continental ties. Vienna navigated the complex bureaucracy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Naples declined as Italy unified and economic gravity shifted northward. Frankfurt's central role weakened as Germany industrialized and Berlin rose. Geography was pulling them in different directions. Family marriages had long been a mechanism of consolidation. Cousins married cousins, reinforcing trust and concentrating wealth. These alliances had kept control tight and minimized external interference. But such arrangements also intensified internal complexity. As families grew larger, so did claims to wealth. More heirs meant more distribution. More distribution meant more negotiation. Wealth fragmentation is quiet, but relentless. A single patriarch's fortune can be decisive. By the 3rd and 4th generation, that fortune is divided among dozens of descendants. Even if assets remain substantial, influence becomes diluted. The London branch, under leaders like Lionel de Rothschild, expanded into British politics, even securing a seat in Parliament after legal barriers for Jews were lifted. Political integration brought prestige, but also national alignment. Meanwhile, in Paris, the French branch pursued its own strategic priorities, particularly in railways and industrial financing within France. These differences did not immediately fracture the network, but they introduced friction. Disagreements emerged over risk tolerance, over market exposure, over political alliances. London's approach, shaped by British imperial confidence, sometimes diverged from Paris's more cautious continental perspective. There was no dramatic family schism, no public feud splashed across newspapers. But unity was no longer effortless. The 5 arrows were under strain. External forces compounded internal tension. New banking houses rose across Europe and America. Joint stock banks expanded. Financial markets matured. The Rothschild monopoly on sovereign debt issuance eroded a state's diversified funding sources. Competition changed the game. The family adapted, shifting toward investment banking, infrastructure projects, and mining ventures. But the scale of dominance seen during the Napoleonic era was harder to replicate in a modernizing financial landscape. At the same time, nationalist sentiment intensified across Europe. Cross-border coordination. Once their greatest strength became politically sensitive, could a London house coordinate seamlessly with Paris during moments of diplomatic tension? Could branches maintain unified strategies when their host nations viewed each other as rivals? The answer required diplomacy, not just with governments, but within the family itself. Private agreements became more formalized. Trust arrangements outlined profit-sharing mechanisms and inheritance structures. Voting control in key ventures was carefully negotiated. They understood the danger. If branches acted purely independently, the network would dissolve into 5 unrelated houses. Still wealthy, but less powerful together than apart. So they preserved cooperation where it mattered most. Major transactions still involved consultation across cities. Intelligence still flowed privately, Personal correspondence reinforced loyalty, but the emotional intensity of the founding generation had faded. The brothers who once rode the edge of war had been bound by urgency. Their grandchildren inherited stability. Stability softens discipline, and discipline had been the core of the 5-0 strategy. The Frankfurt branch, once central, declined in relative influence as Germany's financial leadership shifted toward larger institutions in Berlin. Naples eventually closed as a major house, reflecting geopolitical realignments in Italy. The network was contracting geographically, yet contraction did not equal collapse. The London and Paris houses remained formidable. They continued financing infrastructure, mining enterprises, and sovereign debt. Their wealth remained immense by European standards, but the era of singular continental dominance was passing. The empire was becoming a constellation, related but not centralized. This fragmentation was not entirely negative. Diversification reduced systemic risk. Independent decision-making allowed flexibility in different markets. But it also diluted the myth. The Rothschilds were no longer an unbreakable fist. They were powerful branches, connected by heritage and shared interests, but influenced by local priorities. 5 arrows held together loosely are still strong, but they no longer feel unbreakable. As the 20th century approached, new storms gathered: global war, revolution, an economic upheaval on a scale even the founding generation had never imagined. The question was no longer whether the family could dominate, it was whether it could endure. Unity had built the empire. Now unity would be tested not by competition, but by history itself. The arrows had not snapped, but they were bending, and bending, under enough pressure, can change the shape of even the strongest hand. Chapter 9: War, Revolution, Survival. Empires built in peace are tested in war. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Rothschild name still carried weight in European finance. The London and Paris houses remained influential. The family retained vast investments in railways, mining, and government bonds, but the world they had mastered was disappearing. In 1914, Europe went to war again. World War I was not a contained conflict like the Napoleonic campaigns. It was industrialized slaughter, entire economies mobilized. Gold standards were suspended. Governments seized control of industries. Borders closed. International finance, the lifeblood of the Rothschild model, fractured overnight. The family's cross-border coordination became far more complicated. London and Paris were allied. Vienna and Frankfurt were tied to the Central Powers. Brothers who once coordinated fluidly across capitals now found themselves in enemy states. Neutrality became impossible. Bond markets collapsed in the early days of the war. Capital controls restricted movement of funds. Governments printed money to finance military campaigns. The world of discrete sovereign bond issuance was replaced by emergency war financing, directed by states themselves. For the Rothschild houses, the disruption was severe. Assets denominated in foreign currencies became uncertain. Investments in railway infrastructure across borders were affected by shifting front lines. The very interconnectedness that once gave them power now exposed them to fragmentation. But they endured. They had diversified beyond sovereign bonds decades earlier. Mining interests and domestic holdings cushioned some losses. The London house, embedded in the British system, remained relatively stable compared to continental branches. Still, the war altered the map permanently. When it ended in 1918, empires had collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, central to the Vienna branches, influence was dismantled. The Russian Empire fell into revolution. The Ottoman Empire dissolved. Revolutions do not honor contracts. The Russian Revolution of 1917 dealt another blow. Assets connected to Russian state debt evaporated when the Bolsheviks repudiated imperial obligations. Many European investors suffered massive losses. The Rothschild network was not immune. The orderly world of 19th century sovereign finance had been replaced by ideological upheaval. The family adjusted again. They retreated from certain sovereign exposures. They restructured portfolios. They leaned more heavily into private banking and industrial investments where control was clearer. But the greatest storm was still ahead. In the 1930s, Europe darkened again, not just economically, but morally. The rise of Nazism in Germany transformed anti-Semitic rhetoric into state policy. Jewish familias, regardless of wealth or patriotism, were targeted. The Frankfurt branch of the Rothschild family faced immediate danger. Under Nazi pressure, Jewish banking houses were expropriated or forced into areas, a process by which assets were confiscated or transferred under coercion. The family had faced prejudice before. This was different. This was systematic persecution backed by the state. Properties were seized. Businesses were forced into sales at suppressed prices. Jewish bankers were removed from positions of influence. Travel restrictions intensified. Survival required swift action. Many members relocated. Some moved to Britain, France, or the United States. Others sought refuge wherever possible. Networks that once moved gold discreetly now moved families urgently. The London and Paris houses became lifelines for relatives escaping continental Europe. Assets were restructured where possible. International diversification, once a growth strategy, became a survival strategy. The family's long-standing habit of geographic spread proved critical. Had they remained concentrated in a single territory, the outcome might have been catastrophic. Instead, branches outside Nazi-controlled areas preserved portions of wealth and influence. Even so, losses were real. The Frankfurt house effectively ceased as a major force. The Vienna branch was crippled by annexation. Properties across Central Europe were seized or destroyed. The empire bent sharply. World War II deepened the crisis. Occupied France threatened the Paris branch. British resilience preserved London operations. But uncertainty dominated Europe. Financial influence mattered little against totalitarian regimes. Survival required humility, discretion, and strategic retreat. The Rothschilds, once accused of invisible dominance, were now vulnerable in ways unimaginable a century earlier. And yet, they did not disappear. When the war ended in 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Old aristocracies were weakened. Industrial assets were damaged. Political systems were restructured. The financial architecture of the continent would be rebuilt under American influence and new institutions like the IMF and World Bank. The Rothschild houses were no longer singular architects of sovereign finance. The world had changed too radically for that, but they remained. Their capital, though reduced, was intact enough to participate in reconstruction. Their name, though battered by propaganda, still carried weight in certain financial circles. Most importantly, the Favaro philosophy of diversification and unity had preserved them from annihilation. They had lost territory. They had lost assets. They had lost branches, but they had not lost continuity. The 20th century tested them more severely than any previous era. War disrupted markets. Revolution erased debts. Persecution targeted identity. Yet the dynasty endured, not untouched, but unbroken. The empire no longer dominated Europe as it once had, but survival itself was victory. The arrows had bent under pressure. They had not snapped. And in the aftermath of devastation, the Rothschild name would begin a quieter chapter, one defined less by spectacle and more by adaptation, because in the end, power is not measured only by expansion. It is measured by survival. Chapter 10. Punto. Reinvention in the shadows. The age of kings had faded. The age of empires had fractured, and the age of global institutions had begun. After World War II, the world no longer revolved around aristocratic courts or sovereign bond houses. In the same way it once had, the financial system was reshaped by central banks, international organizations, and American economic dominance. The old model, a single family arranging massive sovereign loans across monarchies, was no longer the center of gravity. For the Rothschild dynasty, this could have been the end of relevance. Instead, it became reinvention. The family understood something essential. When power becomes visible, it attracts attention. When power becomes quiet, it endures. The first shift was away from public sovereign dominance. Governments now relied more on institutional syndicates and multilateral lenders. Bond issuance became more democratized through expanding capital markets. The Rothschild houses no longer controlled sovereign credit flows the way they had in the 19th century. So they adapted. Private banking became a cornerstone. Rather than financing states at the highest level, they began focusing more intensely on wealthy individuals, family offices, and discrete capital preservation. Generational wealth management replaced wartime liquidity coordination. This shift was strategic. Private banking requires discretion. Relationships are long-term. Reputation matters more than headlines. It fit the family's historic strengths. At the same time, investment banking evolved. In London, the Rothschild house played a role in corporate advisory services, mergers, and capital raising. They positioned themselves not as speculative traders, but as trusted advisors in high-level transactions. This advisory model was different from sovereign bond dominance. Instead of underwriting empires, they structured corporate deals. Instead of financing wars, they advised on mergers. The skill set translated well. Negotiation, confidentiality, cross-intelligence. The family name still carried credibility in elite circles. That credibility opened doors in boardrooms rather than royal courts. In Paris, the branch maintained strong relationships in European industrial sectors. Asset management grew in importance. Controlling and preserving capital across generations became central. The world of finance had become more complex, more regulated, more transparent, more competitive. But complexity rewards experience. The Rothschild houses were no longer singular giants in global finance. They did not rival the scale of modern multinational banks. They did not dominate stock exchanges. Instead, they operated within niches of influence. The advisory roles in high-value transactions, private wealth preservation, strategic investment in energy, mining, and infrastructure. Influence had become specialized. In the late 20th century, as financial globalization accelerated, the family adapted again. Some branches consolidated operations. Others expanded internationally under modern corporate structures. The London branch, for example, evolved into a modern financial services group focusing on advisory and asset management. It retained independence rather than merging fully into larger banking conglomerates. This independence echoed the founding principle: unity over absorption. The family no longer needed to dominate markets publicly. It needed to remain relevant. Discretion became philosophy. Unlike hedge fund managers who courted media attention, the Rothschild approach emphasized privacy. Public interviews were rare. Public spectacle was avoided. Power became quieter. In the 19th century, their influence was measured in sovereign bond issuance. In the 21st century, it was measured in advisory mandates and private capital flows. The scale had shifted, but the principle remained. Control over capital shapes outcomes. Meanwhile, myths persisted. Conspiracy theories continued to exaggerate their influence, painting them as omnipotent shadow figures controlling global finance. The reality was more restrained. They were wealthy. They were influential within specific financial domains, but they were not singular rulers of global markets. Modern finance is too diffuse for that. Still, the family preserved something rare: continuity. Few dynasties survived 3 centuries in finance. Even few would do so while adapting across monarchies, industrial revolutions, world wars, and globalization. The reinvention was not dramatic. There was no proclamation, no empire re-announced. There was only adjustments. Private banking, desks replaced sovereign war rooms. Boardroom advisory replaced battlefield financing. Asset management replaced emergency liquidity. The 5 arrows were no longer raised against continental rivals. They were aligned quietly across corporate structures. Power no longer required spectacle. It required precision. And precision, as always, was their discipline. The dynasty that once shaped Europe's bond markets had become something subtler, an enduring financial family operating in high advisory and wealth preservation. Less visible, as mythic in scale. UT still present. Ower had not vanished. T had simply lowered its voice. And sometimes, the quietest influence lasts the longest. Chapter 11, What They Control Today. The legend says they control everything. The reality is quieter in the 19th century. The Rothschild name was synonymous with sovereign finance. Governments borrowed from them. Empires negotiated through them. Their signature could move markets. Today, the landscape looks very different. Modern global finance is dominated by massive multinational institutions, public corporations, central banks, and sovereign wealth funds. No single family, no matter how historic, commands that scale alone. And the Rothschild dynasty does not claim to. Instead, their presence exists in a different form. Still wealthy, still influential, but decentralized. The modern branches of the Rothschild family operate primarily through private banking and investment firms. In London, the house evolved into a global advisory and wealth management institution known for high-level corporate advisory services and asset management. Rather than underwriting wars or issuing sovereign bonds at scale, the firm focuses on mergers and acquisitions, strategic financial advice, and long-term capital stewardship. It is influenced through expertise, not spectacle. Across Europe and beyond, various Rothschild family members maintain diversified investment portfolios. These include stakes in energy, mining, financial services, agriculture, and infrastructure. But these investments are typically structured through modern corporate entities, regulated, transparent within legal frameworks, and subject to market forces like any other major firm. There is no singular, central command. The empire of the 19th century has become a network of financial entities and private holdings linked by heritage rather than rigid coordination. Private wealth operations are a major pillar of the family's modern presence, serving high-net-worth clients, family offices, and institutional investors. These operations emphasize discretion and long-term strategy. This aligns with their historical identity. Confidentiality remains currency. Real estate holdings also form part of the family's legacy. Historic estates in Britain and France, vineyards, and agricultural properties remain under family control. These are not only assets but symbols of generational continuity. Art collections further illustrate this continuity. For generations, the Rothschild family collected paintings, manuscripts, rare objects, and decorative arts. Some collections were lost or looted during wartime. Others remain intact or have been donated to museums. These collections reflect cultural integration as much as financial capacity. They signify arrival into Europe's elite society, from ghetto origins to patronage of art and culture. But the myth of omnipotence no longer aligns with financial reality. The Rothschilds do not dominate global bond markets today. They do not control central banks. They do not dictate sovereign fiscal policy, Doc. Global finance is too vast, too complex, and too regulated for that. Instead, their wealth is significant, but distributed. Multiple branches exist across different countries. Some focus on finance. Others pursue philanthropic, agricultural, or entrepreneurial ventures. Decentralization has replaced centralized dominance. This shift is not decline. It is even 3 centuries of survival required adaptation, from court factors to sovereign bankers, from industrial financiers to private advisors, from continental dominance to specialized expertise. The legend persists because history was dramatic. The reality persists because it is disciplined. The modern Rothschild name still carries prestige in financial circles. Advisory mandates involving complex cross-border transactions often involve experienced firms with deep historical roots. But the mystique of secret control belongs more to pamphlets and conspiracy narratives than to balance sheets. The family's influence today is institutional rather than imperial. They are participants in global finance, not rulers of it. Still wealthy, still connected, but operating within systems shaped by thousands of actors. And yet, something remarkable remains. Few families can trace continuous financial activity across 3 centuries. Fewer still have navigated revolutions, wars, expropriations, and systemic change while retaining relevance. Their survival is the true legacy. The 5-row symbol once represented continental unity. Today, it represents continuity. Legend and reality often diverge. The legend imagines a hidden empire pulling strings. The reality reveals a historic dynasty that adapted, decentralized, and professionalized within modern financial systems. They are not kings of Europe. They are heirs of a strategy built in Frankfurt's Jewish. A strategy rooted in diversification, discretion, and unity. The empire no longer commands headlines the way it once did, but it remains. And in finance, longevity is a form of power. The legend tells of dominance. The reality tells of endurance and endurance. In a world that constantly resets itself, may be the greater achievement. Chapter 12, The Final Arrow. It begins where it began. A hand. 5 arrows, held together. When Mayer Amschel Rothschild chose that symbol, he was not designing a logo. He was designing a warning. Alone, each arrow can be broken. Together, they resist pressure. Across 2 centuries, the Rothschild dynasty proved the strength of that idea, from a locked gate in Frankfurt's Jewish to the financial capitals of London and Paris, from Napoleonic battlefields to industrial railways, from world wars to modern boardrooms. Unity built leverage, but unity alone was not enough. Secrecy protected it. In the 18th and 19th centuries, discretion was armor. Information moved slowly. Trust moved carefully. A private courier could outrun a government dispatch. A coded letter could secure advantage before markets reacted. In Death World, invisibility was strength. They sat behind thrones, not on them. They financed kings without becoming kings. But the world does not remain still. The 21st century operates under different rules. Information is instant. Financial disclosures are regulated. Markets are global and transparent. Governments scrutinize cross-border capital flows with digital precision. Secrecy today is suspicion. Transparency is expectation. Can a dynasty built on quiet coordination survive in an era of public accountability? The answer lies not in dominance, but in adaptation. The Rothschild Empire of the 19th century was centralized, disciplined, and coordinated across 5 capitals. It financed sovereign debt on a scale that made monarchs dependent. The Rothschild presence of the 21st century is decentralized, professionalized, and embedded within modern financial institutions. It advises rather than commands. It preserves rather than dominates. Power has changed shape. In the 18th century, power meant proximity to princes. In the 19th century, it meant control of sovereign credit. In the 20th century, it meant survival through catastrophe. In the 21st century, it means credibility within systems too large for any single family to control. The dynasty did not conquer. Europe modernized around it, and the family modernized with it. Did unity build the empire? Yes, without the 5-arrow strategy. London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, Frankfurt, there would have been no multinational banking network before its time. The genius was not simply capital, it was coordination. Did secrecy protect it? Often, discretion allowed the family to operate across rival states without inflaming national tensions. Silence shielded them from political entanglements. During times of persecution, cross-border privacy preserved assets and lives. But secrecy also fueled myth. Invisibility invites imagination. Conspiracy narratives grew precisely because influence was quiet. The more discreet the operation, the louder the speculation. Today, modern transparency reshapes that dynamic. Financial institutions publish reports, regulatory frameworks, monitor transactions. Public scrutiny is constant. A dynasty cannot hide behind couriers anymore. But it does not need to. The modern Rothschild presence operates openly within regulated markets. Advisory mandates are documented. Investment portfolios are subject to oversight. The legend of omnipotence has faded into historical exaggeration. What remains is continuity. Few families survive 3 centuries in finance. Even fewer do so while adapting to revolutions, expropriations, industrial transformations, and global wars. The Rothschild story is not one of eternal supremacy. It is one of endurance, They began as outsiders, restricted by law. They rose as financiers, indispensable. The monarchies. They endured persecution and fragmentation. They reinvented themselves in modern markets. The arrows bent. They did not break. In the 18th century, unity meant survival in a ghetto. In the 19th century, it meant continental coordination. In the 20th century, it meant diversification against catastrophe. In the 21st century, it means heritage carried forward through institutions rather than empires. The question is no longer whether they control Europe. The question is whether any dynasty can maintain coherence in a world that accelerates change relentlessly. Transparency replaces secrecy. Institutions replace monarchies. Markets replace empires. Yet the principle of unity remains timeless. 5 arrows. Not because they dominate, but because they endure. The Rothschild dynasty may no longer shape Europe's bond markets the way it once did, but its survival across 2 centuries of upheaval remains extraordinary. From exclusion to influence, from dominance to decentralization, from legend to reality. The crest still exists, and 5 arrows. A reminder that power is not only about conquest, it is about cohesion. 5 arrows, 2 centuries. Still unbroken.